In the South, there are a lot of stories about Buck Harp. Spirit of vengeance, the clan killer, the devil's best friend, the ghost who stalks the White Hoods. The stories also exist in the North, but they're much stronger down here. This is where Buck lived and died, and, in a manner of speaking, lived again. Buck started his life considered to be property, but became a family man, a successful businessman, his own man. When his success and his pride proved to be too embarrassing for a local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan, they murdered Buck and his whole family. Except, Buck couldn't let go. He wouldn't let go. He'd come too far to let go. He was too angry to let go. So he struck a deal with the devil. More accurately, the devil struck a deal with him. I first told you this story in the episode called Up Jumped the Devil. Although he is often portrayed in a negative light in both parable and psalm, the devil has actually never been one to incite evil acts. The devil's the one to punish those acts. He's a jailer of sorts, who keeps watch over the worst souls after they die and are dragged down into his realm by the weight of their own sin. Sometimes, hell isn't big enough, or doesn't move fast enough to punish everyone who has it coming. So the devil reached out to Buck Harp and made him an offer. Take his rage, his anger, his endless well of grief and suffering, and put it to some good use. From that day forward, Buck Harp traveled the country. He collected wood and rope from hanging trees and burnt churches. He built coffins from those materials and then started to fill those coffins with the evil men who hid beneath hoods, the men who spilled innocent blood in the name of hate. He took them back to his home, his land, where he buried them alive. And there they stayed, trapped in between life and death, in endless, suffocating darkness. Buck Harp is a boogeyman who struck fear into the hearts of the heartless. After so many decades of ghost stories about old Buck, one aspiring young Klansman decided the time had come to strike back. This man had a plan, he had a goal, and he had a family obligation to try and find and bring home the kinfolk that Buck had taken from him. It was his intent to find the legendary stretch of land, that field of graves, and see that justice was finally served to Buck Harp. It was time for the chickens to come home to roost. Drinking whiskey in the kitchen and telling scary stories around the fire. music, monsters, and mayhem, killers, cannibals, and cults, fearful fiction and furious fact, tall tales, and terrible truths. This is a scary home companion. The year was 1969, and Nathan Bedford Hastings had a good feeling about the direction the country was taking. The times, they were a-changin', yeah, but a sense of hope was starting to return for him and his people. The so-called leaders of the black community had been toppling like dominoes. Medgar Evers, Herbert Lee, Louis Allen, Sammy Young, O'Neill Moore. Malcolm X was killed by one of his own, which said more than even a silken-tongued orator like Nathan ever could. And then, the previous year, 1968, there was the joyous double whammy of the papist race traitor RFK and the Antichrist himself, MLK, both being killed. And then, the cherry on top came just a week before, when the Chicago Police Department executed Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. And there could be only one way to view that event. The police were finally standing up as proud white men to take down the insidious Black Panther Party. Nathan took a tremendous amount of inspiration from this rising tide of white pride. He could feel the sons and daughters of the Confederacy starting to wake up all around him. After so many moral victories, Nathan felt, no, he knew that now was the right time to strike, to take action against the greatest enemy of his people, Buck Harp. He knew that many of his contemporaries thought that Buck was a legend, a holdover from old times, a ghost story that was intended to keep white children on the straight and narrow. Nathan knew better. He knew the stories were true. And unlike the flesh and blood enemies of the white race, Buck would never stop picking them off until he was stopped permanently. And so on Christmas Eve of 1969, Nathan Bedford Hastings called together a small meeting and laid out his plan to rid the world of the Klan's greatest predator once and for all. Nathan was a new breed of what he liked to call a white warrior. His family was steeped in Confederate heritage, going back to that first iteration of the Klan that was born on Stone Mountain. Over the generations, they had been affiliated with the Red Shirts, the Old Klan, the New Klan, the Knights of the White Camellia, the New White South, the Glorious Ophidians, Sons of the New Dawn, as well as a few of the less reputable organizations. Nathan grew up thinking that all of these different labels and cliques and gangs did more to divide white folks and to put them at odds than to bring them together. He sought to unite all of these groups, to bring all of the white warriors together in a holy army. He saw so many people around him that were motivated by hate for the lesser races. But not him, not Nathan. Nathan was driven by love. Love for a pure white race. This love and devotion propelled him through school and college and gave him the grace and wisdom to never be affiliated with any crimes or criminals. For the betterment of them all, his record and his hands needed to remain spotless. It was his goal to be a proud white leader, to tell people that it was okay to be Caucasian. You didn't have to hide beneath a hood anymore. And he was being groomed for leadership, real leadership, beyond the bounds of the Klan. Maybe even a governor's office one day. But before then, he knew that there was old business that needed settling. And everything that he believed told him that now was the time to strike. Nathan's grandfather, Bill Hastings, had gone missing long before he was born. It was said that Bill was taken by Buck Harp. When Nathan was a young boy, he had a cousin and an uncle who both disappeared on the same night, shortly after an alleged lynching incident. He knew it was Buck Harp. Everyone knew it, but what could they do about it? It was that day, that very day, that young Nathan vowed he would restore his family's honor. Alongside his crazy Uncle Eager, they began to collect the data, to process every story that had ever been told about Buck Harp, and to build a plan. And all of that had led to this day. In the back room of the local Red Shirts meeting hall, Nathan stood before half a dozen men who shared a very singular connection. Each of their families had lost someone to Buck Harp. He spoke to each of these men in turn, making sure they all knew how bonded in blood they really were. Besides Nathan, there was his uncle, Eager Jackson, Clark Seagram, Tedrow Anderson, Skeeter White, and the Meeks boys, Leroy and Tyrone. All of their family trees had seen proud white men taken, never to be returned. And now they had a chance, a real chance, to learn the truth, to set things right. He and Uncle Eager had been tracing Buck Harp sightings for years, linking them all, marking them on a Pepe Sylvia-style corkboard map. They had a target area narrowed down to a small stretch of land in the northeast section of Alabama. It was a lot of ground to cover, but small enough that they could do it. They could grid search and they could find the legendary farmland of Buck Harp, where he grew fields of wooden crosses atop hundreds of white graves. As Nathan showed the men what he had learned, he saw the intensity in each of their faces. They knew he was on to something. We can do it, gentlemen. We are going to find him. We are going to hang him. And this time, we will make sure that it sticks. Then, only then, we can look for the ones that we lost and give them a proper white Christian burial. There was a hue and cry, and the last great crusade of the white warrior was underway. The hunting party left Knoxville at first light, sights set on a swath of rural Alabama. During Reconstruction, this area had been a hotbed for white warriors, but had long ago become abandoned. Even more suspiciously, since the turn of the century, more and more black folks had been moving into the area. There were now several small townships that were primarily black. A place that used to echo with the sound of stretching rope had turned into an enclave where the black community felt safe. Nathan thought he knew why. He believed it was because they were living close to Buck Harp, the avenging angel of lynching. Although Nathan had done more in-depth research on lynching in America than almost anyone, and was very knowledgeable in that history, I will spare you his thoughts on the matter. Instead, I would like to present to you a more accurate perspective on the subject. Here is historian and friend of the show, Dr. Edgar James Evans.
4,733 racial terror lynchings occurred in the U.S. between 1882 and 1951, according to Tuskegee Institute. What are the statistics for legal convictions in response to lynchings? 0. Lynchings could not be punished by the law because lynching was the law. The judge, the sheriff, the lawyer, they were the men holding the other end of the rope. Now, bearing in mind, there is no reason to think the number of 4,733 is accurate. That is simply a number that is verifiable. I say lynching, and you think a noose, a rope, a tree, but that was only part of it. Any organized act of white violence and murder is a lynching. Then and now. Breonna Taylor and George Floyd are no different than James Byrd or Emmett Till. Acts of terrorism, violence, and murder, wearing the guise of law, order, and justice. Let's discuss the red shirts of South Carolina. In the late 19th century, the red shirts were the paramilitary arm of the Democratic Party in several southern states. Unlike the Klan, the red shirts were very well organized. They were known for intimidation, using guns and manpower to block non-whites and other Republicans from voting. The red shirt was a sign of pride, to make them stand out and help them spread fear. They were so feared when one small black community heard the red shirts were coming. The residents abandoned their homes and hid in the swamps until after voting day. These men and women fled their homes they had built with their own hands, that they legally owned as free Americans, and they took their children to live in the swamps like animals because they knew what would happen if the red shirts got them. And yet there are 0 lynchings, 0 murders, 0 crimes at all attributed to the red shirts. In South Carolina, they are still an active arm of a political group called the League of the South. They hand out pamphlets. They canvass for political candidates. They are a part of the system. If a group as notoriously feared and violent as the Red Shirts have officially never lynched anyone, then you understand why historians with integrity do not accept the number of 4,733 as valid, and never will.
This intrepid band of 7, these Confederate Ghostbusters, began a precise and thorough search of the land in question. They knew it would take at least a couple of weeks, and maybe as long as a couple of months. But they were all bound and determined to not cut any corners. They were going to do this right. Nathan coordinated from a fixed location, and 3 pairs of 2 went out in different directions. They used their trucks to scour the backwoods, carefully checking off boxes on their maps with every tick of the odometer. When the sun fell, they would all reunite. They would build a mighty fire, cook their dinner, and then sip from tin cups of whiskey and tell tales around the crackling flames. For over a week, they searched sunup to sundown and found nothing. And not a one of them ever wavered in their commitment. How could they, with the ever-evocative Nathan leading them, filling their heads with white grandeur, visions of a wonderful future for their children and their children's children? Uncle Eager liked to share ghost stories about the devil's best friend. The devil is a black man, Uncle Eager liked to tell them. He has black skin, and he wears the fine, spun, colorful clothing of a San Francisco dandy. The devil recruits damned souls, like that poor man Buck Harp, to do his bidding because he cannot abide by the goodness of the white race. By doing this, boys, we are not just fighting for our families, for our fallen brothers, for our race. We are also fighting for God. We are striking back against his greatest enemy. And so on, and so forth. They drove by day. They worked the map. They communicated over CB radio. On the 9th day, they stopped when the sun set and gathered once again around the fire. When they had stopped talking, stopped drinking, and curled into their sleeping bags around the embers of the fire, the sounds came to them, drifting on the night breeze. Muffled, distant, but clear enough that they all heard it. Screams. The screams of hundreds of people buried alive, calling out in a choir of misery. "We're close," Nathan said. No one slept a wink that night. At first light, they proceeded on foot, bringing only what they needed: guns, shovels, a length of rope tied into a noose. With God on their side, these holy white warriors ventured out of the thicket of woods and onto the farm of Buck Harp. Nathan boldly led the charge. But as soon as he crossed over, when he saw the horrors of Buck's farm, he collapsed to his knees. The stories were all true. An endless harvest of wooden crosses, sticks lashed together into crude grave markers, spread as far as he could see. Hundreds upon hundreds of them, in neat, tidy little rows. Most of the crosses were adorned with hoods of white or red fabric. They fluttered in the breeze, these flags of fallen warriors. And beneath it all, the endless wailing. Old, raggedy voices screamed hoarse 1,000 times over, still howling for mercy from 6 feet deep. The pitiful cries vibrated in the soil, and it felt like the earth itself reverberated with their sorrow. In the distance, they saw an old farmhouse and a small barn next to it. Nathan pointed, but did not speak. What was left for him to say? He had been fantasizing about this moment every day and every night for pert near 30 years. And here it was, finally, laid out before him. Nathan carried the noose over his shoulder. The others wielded guns and clubs to give them a sense of comfort, but they knew these things would not kill Buck Harp. He had died on the end of a rope, and only ever returned from that because the devil had cut him down, so they would put him back where he had been, back where he belonged, swinging from this very noose Nathan tied with his own 2 hands, his clean hands. They would make sure that Buck stayed put this time, even if they had to stand watch over him until the end of days. The 7 white warriors approached the farmhouse. They found Buck inside the barn, his workhouse. He was building coffins. 6 of them so far, laid out side by side. He held a hammer and a saw. Did not seem surprised to see them. He stared righteous indignation at these men as they surrounded him. He was a tall man, wide across the shoulders, wearing dingy, faded overalls and work gloves. His neck was ringed with bright pink scars, as fresh and glistening as they were when he died. He attacked with hammer and saw. Uncle Eager shot Buck in the chest. Leroy and Tyrone opened up with their scatter guns. It barely slowed Buck down. Skeeter White hit him in the head with his shovel as Clark yanked the hammer from his hand. The 6 men set upon him with boot and fist, driving him to the ground, stripping away his weapons, pinning him prone. Nathan looked down and smiled. They had him. The bullets and the bludgeons did very little, but once Nathan slipped that noose around the black man's neck, once he cinched it tight, the fight started to fade. His men held Buck's arms and legs. Nathan pulled, and they dragged him out of the barn and towards the nearest tree. Never before had Nathan felt anything like this. He had always been so careful to keep his hands clean, to let other people do the dirty work, so that he could lead with a clean conscience, so that he could lead with love. But now, feeling this man struggling for his life at the end of the rope, Nathan was filled with something new. Pinpricks along the base of his brain, goose flesh on his soul. As he set right this old wrong, he felt pure white fire flooding his veins, godhood pulsing within him. They went to the nearest tree, and Nathan tossed the end of the rope over the lowest sturdy limb and started to pull. One by one, his white warrior brothers released their grip on Buck Harp and started to pull on the rope. He stood upright for a moment with his own booted feet touching the ground, and Buck stared at them with eyes of brimstone brown. Nathan looked him right back in the eye, unafraid. He swore it would be the last time Buck's feet ever touched the ground. They all pulled as one, lifting Buck up and off the ground. Nathan, he was the first in line. For the first time, he enjoyed the roughness of the rope in his grip, the tension as the black man started to swing and claw at the noose biting into his neck. They tied it off around the base of the tree, and then Nathan took a few steps back to admire his handiwork. "My name is Nathan Bedford Hastings, you black son of a bitch. You took my kin, and now I'm settling the debt." Buck released the noose with one of his hands and pointed out into the field of graves. Nathan followed his lead and saw something that immediately grabbed his attention. On one of those crosses, one of those gently flapping hoods stood out to him. He'd seen an old photo of it hanging over his grandmother's mantel. It was a portrait of his grandpa, Bill Hastings, standing next to the exalted Cyclops of the Ku Klux Klan. It was a very unique white hood with a stitched red cross over one of the eye holes. Nathan ran to this grave, to this cross, to this hood, and snatched it up with trembling hands. He turned it inside out, knowing exactly what to look for. Near the top, right by the seam, the words B. Hastings, scrawled in what was very clearly his grandmother's handwriting. "It's him," Nathan shouted, drawing the others over to him. "Bring the shovel. This is my granddaddy." The other men got excited and started to look around for their own missing kin. Brothers, let's start here. Help me dig up this grave. Then we will find everyone we came here for." With picks and shovels, they tore into the ground. Nathan dug deeper and worked harder than any of them. The more he dug, the louder the wailing of the damned became. It sounded like it was coming from directly below, but in truth it was coming from everywhere. An infinite chorus of trapped souls and shredded minds. The hole grew deeper, and now there was only room for Nathan. The others rimmed the lip of the open grave, watching him work, watching as he tapped the wooden lid of a coffin with his shovel. He handed the shovel up to Leroy and pried back the edge of the lid, slowly opening it, revealing nothing. It was just an empty pine box. "What is this?" he cried inwardly and looked up to the sky for answers. His white brothers were gone. He was alone in this empty grave. Nathan clawed his way out up the side of the grave and pulled himself up to ground level. The other 6 were laid out, side by side by side, as neat as you please, each one in a new coffin. The same boxes Buck had been finishing when they first arrived. Behind these coffins, the freshly hung noose swung empty in the gentle breeze. Buck Harp held the shovel in his hands. Before Nathan had time to say anything in his own defense, that shovel collided with the side of his head, sending him sprawling back into that freshly dug grave and that empty pine box. From time to time, the devil would come by to visit his old friend. He always brought whiskey and tobacco. Buck would build a fire, and they would sit in handmade rocking chairs, looking at the stars and listening to those oh-so-righteous screams as they drifted up from the earth. And on this night, as they sat overlooking 7 fresh graves, the devil laughed and laughed and could not stop laughing until tears dripped from his cat-like eyes and he slapped his silk-clad knees with finely manicured hands. "I cannot believe it. I cannot believe you actually got that dumb cracker to dig his own grave." Thank you for listening to another episode of A Scary Home Companion. To hear more about Buck Harp, Southern Spirit of Vengeance, check out Up Jumped the Devil and Blood. You can find the show on social media, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, or contact us directly at ascaryhomecompanion@gmail.com. We have hot swag on Redbubble. Or, best of all, sign up for the Patreon. Become a patron of A Scary Home Companion. Just a few bucks a month. You get early release episodes, behind-the-scenes analysis videos, bonus material, and episodes that will never get a wide release. We have an episode about sniper nuns, the Vespers taking on a cartel. Apex Predator's Aftermath gives you the closure you seek from that epic 2-part episode. And the upcoming Death Rides pits ace driver Lurleen Stokes against a biker gang that is also a ghastly cult. Sign up today. This episode was edited and produced, as well as conceived, by Jeff Davidson. It guest starred Alex Crider-Evans as Dr. Edgar James Evans. Music this time around was all by Lobo Loco. Catch the Train, Country Boy, Valley of No Return, and Spencer were the name of those songs. And as always, Chelsea Oxendine with the theme music.